रोशनी का कारवां।
This podcast is brought to you by Score Foundation.
ये है रोशनी, रोशनी, रोशनी का कारवां, रोशनी। Eyeway, ये है रोशनी का कारवां।
Hi, my name is George Abraham and welcome to Eyeway Conversations. My guest today is from the United Kingdom, Matthew Horspool, who lives in Coventry and is a self-employed professional. Hi, Matthew, welcome.
Hi, George. It's a real pleasure to be part of the program today.
I believe you have been visually impaired from childhood. So would you like to tell our listeners how did this blindness happen and what was your early childhood like?
Yeah, absolutely. To be honest, we don't really know how the blindness happened. We're not really sure whether it's genetic or whether it was just a freak accident during birth, or we don't really know. What we do know is that the condition that I have two conditions. One is called bilateral microphthalmia, which means both of my eyes are very small. And the other condition is called coloboma, which means that the eye is not quite the right shape. And the bilateral coloboma as well. So it's both eyes that are slightly the wrong shape. And the practical outcome of that is that I actually can't see anything. I have no light perception. I can't tell whether it's light or dark. I can't tell whether it's morning or evening. And this has been the case since birth. I was diagnosed relatively early on, I think probably about 10 months after I was born. And of course, my parents were very upset about it. But over time, managed to figure out ways forward and figure out how to allow me to develop. And we were a Christian family. We went to church. There were one or two people at the church that I went to and also at partner churches who worked in the visual impairment sector. There was one person who actually worked at the school that ultimately I went to. There was another person who worked for the local authority. And so through them, we learnt about a school called Priestley Smith School, which is a school for the blind. And I started at Priestley Smith at the same time as everybody else. At the same time as every other child would start school, and basically went right the way through then until I was 16. And then at 16, I went to another college for the blind down in Hereford for 3 years, and then I went to university.
So what was your early memories of childhood?
Yeah, I didn't make many friends, and I think that was something I was always very sad about, was that I didn't have friends, and I really felt very aware of this, and it was something that I always wanted to change, but I never really knew how. I didn't play outside the front of the house. We had a back garden, and so I was able to play out in the back garden, and I used to do very simple play activities. We had a quite a large patch of grass with nothing on it, so I used to run up and down the grass. I had a ball with a bell in it that I could kick around. Didn't really enjoy doing that very much, but I did it. In terms of indoor play, I used to enjoy playing with things like Play-Doh. That was a lot of fun. And I discovered from a very early age that I was very musical. There was a piano at my grandma's house, and I used to enjoy playing that. And I just used to enjoy, knocking on the table and stamping my feet on the floor and things like that. And I mean, ultimately, that led to me pursuing quite a strong interest in music and in singing in particular. But that was really, I think, probably central to what I did, was to play with musical things and to develop that sense of music as a very small child.
What does a day in the life of a blind child in a school in the UK look like?
I should say at the outset that there's been a bit of a transition. There was a time probably 30 or 40 years ago, when every blind child in the UK went to a school for the blind. And gradually there's been a transition away from that and towards blind children going to mainstream school. And when I was young, that transition was in its infancy. So probably about half of my blind friends went to blind school and half of my blind friends went to mainstream school. It's very much the case that most blind children now are in mainstream. That transition is has happened, really, other than one or two schools for the blind. The class sizes were very small. A typical mainstream class has about 30 children in it. The school that I went to, my class was about 6 children, with one teacher and one teaching assistant per class. And so there was a ratio of about one staff member to 2 children. But I mean, it was taught, normal length of lesson, normal curriculum, even for subjects like maths and science. There were various parts of the curriculum that were taught differently, and some bits were taught slower than others, and some bits were taught faster than others to make up some time. But yeah, it was the normal curriculum.
If you were to look back at your school days, what were the critical skills of life that you learned, which are useful to you today?
I think Braille. Braille was one of the very first things I learned, and this is the advantage, of course, of going to a school for the blind, is that sighted children are taught to handwrite at a very early age, and this is just part of the curriculum for them, is to learn to handwrite. And so learning Braille slotted very nicely into that environment. While partially sighted children were learning to write, I was also learning to write. It's just I was learning to write in Braille. And this was a very useful skill. It helped me enormously in maths and science in particular, which were taught almost exclusively through Braille and through tactile diagrams and through 3D models and various creative ways of making those. Like you'd have a tactile grid on a corkboard, and you'd have pins and you'd have elastic bands, and you'd make up a line graph using pins and bands on a board. But I mean, Braille was central to that, because without being able to read Braille, I wouldn't have been able to have such a developed sense of touch to be able to work with all of these things. So this is a very key skill. I suppose the other key skills that I really learnt at school were mobility, travelling around with a white cane, a little bit of how to cook and look after myself as a blind person, although actually most of that I learnt just by listening to other blind people and how they did it, and I learnt a lot of that in adulthood rather than at school. And technology was just sort of coming in at the time, so I learnt a bit of technology at school. I learnt just enough technology at school, computer skills, to be able to use the computer at home. And once I'd learnt how to use the computer at home, I learnt the rest through just Google searching and things like that. But yeah, I suppose those were the key skills, really. And then, of course, the curriculum itself. But those were the key skills on top of that.
If you know of anyone with vision impairment who needs guidance in living life with blindness, please share the Eyeway National Helpline number 8800004334. The number is 8800004334.
Do you see any kind of change in teachers' training programs in colleges where they train academicians and teachers for the education sector, ever since the teachers have to deal with an inclusive class?
Not really. Not to the extent that we need it to be taught. I mean, I would love to see all teachers going through teacher training have to learn sign language and have to learn grade 1 Braille, for example. I would love to see that on the teaching curriculum, and would have to understand what a screen reader is, what a screen magnifier is. Not necessarily understand how to use it, but understand those core things. Understand, a white cane and things like this. I don't see any of this. What I see a lot of is teachers are basically taught, listen, you have to accommodate these people in your classrooms, but when you have somebody who you need to accommodate, then there will be specialists who will come in to help you. And there are specialists who come in to help, but those specialists have to go to so many schools that there isn't enough contact time with the specialist for it to be as beneficial as it should be.
You said that after school, 12 years of schooling, at the age of 16, you went for a 3-year program in college and then further into university. What exactly did you do in college and in university? What were the subjects you took up, and what were the highlights that you were excited about?
Yeah. Well, I went to college down in Hereford. I studied my A-levels down there. We have GCSEs, which used to be called O-levels or ordinary levels.
Yeah.
And we have A-levels, which are advanced levels. So I studied my A-levels down at Hereford. What I liked about Hereford was that it was residential, and so it gave me an opportunity to really hone in on social skills and domestic, life skills. I did a lot more long cane work while I was down in Hereford. I did a lot more cooking and learning to use a washing machine and learning how to make a bed and how to do your ironing and all of that sort of stuff. I learned all of that down in Hereford, and that was really quite transformational for me because it taught me that I actually could be an adult and I could be independent and I could stand on my own 2 feet. So that was there. And then I went to Coventry University, which is how I came to Coventry, actually. I went to Coventry University and studied computer science. And that was actually quite a lonely experience. I'd gone from having no friends as a child to having lots of friends at college, to then all of a sudden finding myself in a position where, once again, I'm the only blind person in a sea of sighted people. And I just didn't have the skills. It sort of harkens back to what I was saying about mainstreaming people. I didn't have the skills really at that time to interact with sighted people because all of my life up until then I've been interacting with blind people. So I found myself very at sea and really very lonely and really very sad. But I did study computer science, and that was very rewarding. It was also very frustrating because I realized that I didn't want to become a computer programmer, but I learned a lot of skills that subsequently became very useful.
So after you finished your stint at Coventry University, I guess your next question was employment.
Yeah, I was determined to have a job. About 80% of blind people in the UK are unemployed, and this is a really worrying statistic, and it's been that way for a long time, and people have proposed various ways of solving the problem, and none of them seem to have worked. So I was absolutely determined that I was going to be employed, and by luck of the draw, there was a school actually who needed somebody who knew Braille and who knew technology to support one of their blind pupils. So I essentially took quite a low-paid job because I didn't know what else I was going to do, helping to produce the Braille and helping to teach the Braille and to teach the technology. And that was very rewarding. And I spent about 5 years there, got that pupil through GCSEs, and she left and went on to somewhere else. And by that point, I'd made lots of connections with other people. I'd started to become very involved with the Braille Authority, which in the UK is called UCAF, the UK Association for Accessible Formats. So I got involved on a few committees there because there were things I wanted answers to, and it turned out there weren't any answers, and so I started to write my own. So yeah, got very involved in there. And then this kind of led up to the COVID pandemic, and out of the other side of the COVID pandemic came a huge backlog of people who wanted face-to-face training, mostly in the workplace, and agencies who couldn't fulfill that backlog. And so I got taken on a contract basis by a couple of different agencies to basically help them clear the backlog. And then that was what led me into what I do now.
Which is?
Which is corporate training. So I did a very brief stint actually for an organisation called Torch Trust, which looks after blind people in the church. And I did a bit of disability awareness training in churches. That lasted for probably about 2 or 3 years. And then, what I do now is go around up and down the country, on the train or whatever, meeting blind people in their workplaces and helping them to do their work more efficiently using assistive technology such as JAWS or such as Braille displays. So for some people, that's just a case of coming in and setting up their technology for them and checking that it all works. For others, we might be starting from scratch. They might have lost their sight and then need to be retrained so that they can take on a new job. For some people, they've been using something like JAWS for quite a long time and they have good JAWS skills in basic programs like Microsoft Word and Outlook and on the internet, but they might need to use a more complicated program like Teams or SharePoint or Salesforce or something like that. And so there's some extra training that's needed just to bring them up to speed with those programs.
Is it the corporate that actually supports this level of training, or is the government involved? How does it work in the UK?
So it depends on the size of the organization. There are always some very large corporates who will just say, look, we're going to pay for it because we think it's the right thing to do. But for the most part, we have an act in the UK called the Equality Act. The Equality Act sets out the fact that organizations, whether they're corporates or charities or whatever they are, must make reasonable adjustments to include disabled people. So and a company can't simply discriminate against a blind person. A company can't say, no, you can't work here because you're blind. A company has to, if the person meets all the other criteria, has to appoint that person and has to have that person on the workforce, and has to supply, equipment and things like that to make the workplace work for that person. So they'd have to provide a laptop for every other person. Therefore, they'd have to provide a laptop for the blind person. But there are some expenses like the expense of, say, JAWS or a Braille display or any other assistive technology that the person might need that might just be too big for a workplace to realistically be able to afford or morally be expected to afford. And in those cases, there's a scheme called Access to Work. And what would happen is the employee and the employer between them would put in an application for Access to Work. Access to Work would undertake an assessment and would say, yes, you're blind, of course, you need JAWS, that's fine. Access to Work would then pay for JAWS, and they would also, if it was required, pay for the training for the blind person to be able to use JAWS. And so most of my work is Access to Work based work. What usually happens is that Access to Work makes a grant to the employer, and then the employer would commission me. So my relationship is with the employer, not with Access to Work, but it's funded through the Access to Work process.
To support our work with the blind and visually impaired, you can visit the donate page on our website www.scorefoundation.org.in. Please note www.scorefoundation.org.in.
Yeah, staying on the accessibility subject, banking and there are a lot of operations which are now done through apps, whether it's iOS or Android. So what is your awareness or what is your experience? Are these apps kind of designed with accessibility in mind, or people with blindness have to advocate for it and then, have the app developers kind of make changes? Are people who develop apps kind of aware of the accessibility needs of blind people?
I think they're becoming aware of the needs of blind people. There is still some advocacy which blind people need to do. Some of that advocacy is actually done by the organisations which support blind people. So organisations like RNIB, for example, do a lot of advocacy on behalf of blind people in these sorts of areas. And we have a few organisations, AbilityNet being one of them, which does accessibility testing from a blindness angle. And so I know of one or two banks that have actually commissioned AbilityNet to do that accessibility testing and to help them make the app more accessible. So the position that we're in now is that I think I would say that most of the high street banks have apps that are accessible. Some are easier to use than others, and so there are some blind people who would tend, more towards one bank than another. But the app is accessible, provided that you know how to use a smartphone in the first place. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying in the last question. For those that can use a smartphone, the apps work really well. There are a lot of people who can't use a smartphone, and there are some really worrying steps backwards in terms of accessibility for those people. Automated teller machines, the hole in the wall where you put your card in and you get cash out. There was a point probably 10, 15 years ago where most of those were equipped with headphone sockets, and you could plug a pair of headphones in and they would talk. And gradually over time, that has been allowed to go unchecked. It's not been maintained properly. The headphone socket's broken. There's been a firmware update and it's broken the talking aspect of it. And so people who can't use a smartphone are really being very disadvantaged. We're seeing lots of touchscreen card machines, FPOS, point of sale machines.
Yeah.
We're seeing lots of those. And if you're a smartphone user, you overcome that by using Apple Pay or Android Pay. If you're not a smartphone user, it really has very devastating consequences for privacy. You have to share your PIN number with someone who you don't know. So there's a lot of work still to be done. And I think people are aware on one level, but not aware on another.
Matthew, when you were a child, you said that you liked the sound of music. You played a little piano. You loved the sound of rhythm. Has music continued to be part of your life, or you gave it up in childhood?
Well, I gave it up for a little bit while I was at college and university. But no, music's always been part of my life. As I progressed through childhood, I said we were a Christian family. I joined the church choir when I was about 8 or 9 and sung a lot of services there. There was a choir called the City of Birmingham Symphony Youth Chorus, which I joined for a few years, 2 or 3 years, until my voice broke. And then more recently, I've picked it up again, joined my church choir at university and one thing or another. And now, having graduated and got better and better and better, now actually sing in the choir at Coventry Cathedral. I sing tenor in the choir there. So we actually have quite a light load for a Church of England cathedral. We sing one service on a Sunday morning and one service on a Sunday evening, and we have a practice on a Wednesday evening, and that's for most weeks.
Finally, did you watch the India-England cricket series that happened in the UK recently?
I was aware that it was happening. I haven't watched it. I'm not much of a cricket person, I'm afraid.
Well, Matthew, it was wonderful chatting with you. It was wonderful getting to know the various things that you've been doing and the various things that happen with blind people in the UK. Wish you the very best.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be on the programme. Thank you very much.
Eyeway, ये है रोशनी का कारवां.
This podcast was brought to you by Score Foundation.
ये है रोशनी, रोशनी, रोशनी का कारवां, रोशनी. Eyeway, ये है रोशनी का कारवां.